Are you new to teaching elementary music, or do you feel like you're just spinning your wheels every day in your classroom? Maybe you're overwhelmed and honestly just don't know where to go for advice and mentorship. Hi, I'm Jessica, and when I'm not drinking all the coffee, watching Razorback sports, or hanging out with my family of boys, it's my passion to help elementary music teachers just like you teach your students by using your unique personality and teaching style. In this podcast, you'll find helpful tips, strategies, and ideas that will help you kick that stress to the curb and begin teaching music with confidence. Let's get started. Hey friends, normally I do not have a podcast episode coming out on Monday, but today's a special episode. I had some words stewing around in my brain, stewing a word I think it is, but all weekend long, and I didn't want to say anything until I could get my thoughts really put together and formed in a concise way. And my heart with this episode is truly to just share my story in the hopes of helping other white teachers who are maybe navigating waters of teaching your Black students, and you are maybe just not knowing what to do right now. Maybe you want to do the right thing and you want to reach these kids, but you're just not sure what to do. So I want to be that voice. And my Black friends listening to this, my Black teachers who are doing amazing jobs in your community, once again, my heart is truly in the right place to help, encourage, and instruct in what worked for me, what's continuing to work for me, in the hopes of helping move things along a little bit when it comes to white teachers in the music classroom. So with that said, I do have a blog post that goes along with this episode. It is in the show notes, the link to that. And it's just called White Music Teacher Do Better. Okay, so you can head to thedomesticmusician.com, click on blog and search for that, or you can simply see that blog post in the show notes as well. I thought about making this a Facebook Live. I thought about going live on my Instagram. I go live on there occasionally, but I truly felt like my words would come across better on a podcast episode. It's so much easier for me to just talk without the interruptions about seeing who's popping on and off, or saying hey to someone, or hey, post in the comments if you're here. It's just so much easier for me to just record an episode and then, to share my thoughts this way. So that's why I chose to do it in a podcast episode. So like I said, I've been thinking about the right words to say for like a whole week now. I talked to one of my best friends about it, and she said, you do have a lot to say about this, and I ran what I was going to say by her to make sure it sounded okay, and she said, go for it. So here I am. So with that said, I've prayed about this, and I pray, like I said, my words come across in the right way, because I am literally wanting nothing but to come across with a loving and open heart to help someone learn. So let me get started. First, I want to talk about before I began teaching. I, in college, worked with what was the equivalent of the Dream Center, and I think that's actually what it was called in Tulsa. But I volunteered there all the time and loved working with kids in the low-income community where I lived in Tulsa. And that, my heart, oh my goodness, you guys, for these kids, I just loved them. I loved working with these children, and I loved working with their families and getting to know them, and on a deeper level. It was not the same as seeing kids in my classroom, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but each and every day. But just being able to volunteer for a couple hours here or there meant the world to me. I knew in college, I just knew I was called to work in a low-income school. I can't really explain it, but when you feel like you're called to do something, you just can't really put into words why. I just knew it's where I was supposed to be. And that's honestly all through college. I've shared my story, you may or may not have heard, but I started as a piano performance major, and I switched to music education, not just because I wanted to be a music teacher, but because I wanted to be a music teacher in a low-income school. I just knew that's what I wanted to do. So ironically, when that was the only job that opened up, I knew that was a God thing. I just did. And so when I got hired to teach at my first elementary school, I was really excited, like every elementary music teacher is, or anybody entering their first teaching job, I should say. But it was the middle of the school year, and I'm not going to go into that story because I've shared it before, but it was the middle of the school year. But I want to talk about today things I haven't shared before. I knew the school, I had been told in my interview, I hadn't had music for 7 years because of budget cuts and other things. And I obviously knew it was an inner city school. I mean, I drove there. I knew where I was. I was aware of the area and all those things. But I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I didn't really know what to expect. It didn't really mean anything to me, honestly. I just wanted to teach music. I didn't care where. I just wanted to teach music. So, yeah, I was just excited to teach music, to share everything I had learned in college with every class that came through my classroom doors. But then I remember a few stories. I told a couple of my friends and family. I told more than a couple people, but I got a couple comments, I should say, from some of my friends and family members. And I'm not going to mention who, but like, hey, I got a new teaching position and this is where it's at. Why do you want to teach there? Was one question I heard. Or, don't you know it would be way easier for you if you didn't teach in that part of town? And I remember thinking, what? Like, not the reactions I expected to receive from certain people. And so these are the same people who knew my passion and desire to work with kids of poverty. These are the same people who knew I had no desire to work at a school like the one I grew up at. It was an all-white school. I graduated with 2 Black students. And it wasn't until I got to college and I went to a really culturally diverse college that I felt like this is what it's supposed to be like. It's supposed to be kids and sharing experiences and coming together. Just experiencing everybody's different cultures. So those questions and replies definitely caught me off guard. It was probably when I first realized the inadvertent racism that exists in my small world. So while getting ready for the kids to come into my room, I began setting up my classroom. I could hear next door to me pencils being thrown and kids yelling across the room. So I walked next door to peek into what was the art room. There was a long-term substitute in there until I officially started the next week. She was kind of finishing out that week, and her feet were propped up on the desk, reading a book. And she was literally paying no attention to these kids. I remember my jaw pretty much hit the floor thinking, what in the world is going on in there? Like, what's going on in this classroom? Then I got nervous because, remember, first-year teacher here. I had the normal first-year teaching nerves, but I also knew I would be seeing those same kids the next week. I was only given a week to set up my classroom. So I was driving back and forth, getting what I needed and all those things. But then, of course, those new teacher nerves also turn into fear of the unknown. And what if those kids come into my room acting that way? I realized I was now the one developing preconceived notions of these kids without ever giving them a chance, without ever realizing that could it possibly have something to do with the lack of classroom management in there? Could it possibly have something to do with them getting no attention, no instruction, no understanding? I began comparing the behavior I saw to the students I had just worked with in my all-white school student teaching experience. Then the thought came in my head, even though I knew God had placed me there, what if I had made a mistake accepting this teaching position? Oh my word, I cannot believe I even entertained those thoughts. I now realize those thoughts were part of what the problem is now. How many other teachers before me had run away because of these exact reasons? How many of these kids hadn't gotten a quality education because a teacher wasn't willing to work at this school because it would be, air quotes, too hard? I heard through the grapevine, remember I'm new, so I didn't know anything yet, that there had been a huge turnover. Teachers didn't really stick around long enough to give these kids a chance. And that honestly and truly broke my heart. So my first week, all right, so now the students start coming in my room. I was very excited. I had everything prepared. I had everything on the wall that I thought I needed. I had all the colorful posters. And if you've heard my story, I had no instruments. So I couldn't show the kids instruments and say, we're going to be playing these. But I had done everything I could in my power do to set up, or so I thought. It was all about the stuff to me. It was all about setting up the things and, if they see all the stuff on the wall, they'll be excited to be in here. They were going to love my music room, right? I mean, they hadn't had music in 7 years. So of course they're going to love what I'm doing with them. Then my very first day ever, with my very first class, I heard this statement from one of the kids. My mama said, I don't have to listen to you because you're white. What? I literally, once again, I had to hold my tears back and think, what did I get myself into? I was completely caught off guard, as anybody probably would be. I'm thinking these kids are going to just love me. They're going to come in here. I've worked with kids before in their community. Some of them should know who I am by now, right? But why would the students say this? Don't they know I'm here for them? I'm not racist at all. I'm the furthest thing from that. I love everyone. Then I, of course, got my feelings hurt. It became all about me instead of understanding why this sentence was said in the first place. I honestly, truly didn't get it. I got through my first week like most first teachers do. It was a bunch of stumbling around, hoping I was just doing the right thing and covering procedures correctly. There was a lot of advice being thrown my way by my well-meaning mentor teacher about calling their bluff and let them know who's boss. But nothing was said to me about being loving, understanding, and compassionate. So I did what I was taught. I became so strict with the rules and guidelines and didn't let my guard down at all for fear of these kids not liking me because I was white. Of course, they began following my rules I set in place. There was procedures. It was quiet. You could hear a pin drop in there. But were they just doing that just because I told them to? I wasn't really trying to get to know them. They didn't think they could talk to me. They just knew they needed to come in there and sit quietly and not yell. What was that accomplishing? But I didn't know any different at the time. And I'm okay admitting that now. Lost in the shuffle of all of this was me being afraid to understand my students and not even entertaining the thought of forming a relationship with them. I felt lost and really did think I was doing the right thing by them. What they needed to do was follow the rules and then music learning would follow, or so I thought. Then things began to change, and here's why. So I spent hours, as a lot of music teachers do no matter what kind of school you teach in, creating what I thought my students needed, not what they really needed. Then I realized it's important to meet your students where they're at, to not just teach what you know. Adapting, growing, and learning from your students is vital. Sometimes your students can honestly be the best teachers if you let them. It took me a while, but I realized maybe the pushback I was receiving from my students was because I wasn't teaching them what they really needed to be learning. And I wasn't reaching them where they needed to be reached. Music class just wasn't relevant. You see, most of my students grew up in poverty and would live with grandparents, older siblings, were in gangs, parents were in jail, and there would be drive-by shootings the night before. They came to school too tired, worn out, and the last thing they wanted to do was be told to sing some song about something they really didn't care about. I realized I needed to adapt my instruction in big time. How many songs did I teach my students that I could just shift a bit to reach them in a better way? Yes, of course music mattered, but so did connecting with these kids, forming relationships with them, earning their trust, and giving them the love and understanding they needed and deserved. I started remembering that I was teaching school children and not just the curriculum. That changed everything, because I began finding ways to understand my students better, from the way they taught, to what they were talking about, to why they said something a certain way, to their mannerisms. Me taking the time to truly listen and learn allowed my students to feel comfortable not only learning music with me, but to trust me that I understood them as a human being. I began showing up for my students better. I had kiddos of all colors in my classroom, but most of them were Black. But in the music room, everyone was included and everyone learned about each other's histories and musical preferences. We all completely enjoyed making music together. Every child knew they mattered, that their culture mattered, and that they would be celebrated for who they were when they were with me. It took me about 2 years to get to the point where my students and their families felt like they could trust me. You see, there's been a lot of hurt in their life, and a lot of hurt in their life by white people. They saw me after a while as not just the music teacher to their kids, but truly the one creating the music room to be culturally relevant experience to their kiddos. It's ironically when I also won the Teacher of the Year award, when I finally made the shift to really grasping that I needed to reach these kids and not just teach one activity after the other that I was taught to teach. I learned things at conferences and workshops like you all do, yet I knew I needed to adapt these ideas for my students. It couldn't just be a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach. I had to do better for them. My students began developing a love for music, not just for the music room. I didn't just use the folk songs I was told to teach while in college because, let's be honest, a lot of those were written and handed down by white people. I began finding folk songs my students could relate to and learn from, and I loved learning it and teaching it right along with them. When it came to teaching about the composers of the month, I knew it had to be about Black musicians as well as white musicians, not just about jazz and hip hop. I knew I needed to talk to them about what inspired the great Black musicians to write and perform the music they did. This was a question we talked about a lot. It helped them create and appreciate music in a better and deeper way. We also talked about their favorite music artist and why they wrote the music they did and why they enjoy listening to the music they enjoy listening to. It all became about music appreciation, not just me telling them what they should learn. Why did so many of my students go on to pursue music or be in performing ensembles? Because I helped make it relevant for them. They can now see themselves as a musician, not just as another student going through an elementary music class. I began seeing things through their lens. I encouraged my students that they can and will succeed in life and that there is no limits to what they can accomplish in music or not. The behavior issues of a lot of these students was due to so much that they were dealing with at home and they couldn't hold it in any longer at school. My heart began to soften and I began to become a lot more understanding and open to having conversations that they needed me to have with them. I also began showing up in their community more. I'd go to sports events, and then when they were in middle school, go to their ensemble performances. And I also had a set of siblings that lost their mom to a deadly shooting. This experience rocked me to my core. And sitting at her funeral with other teachers, I began understanding the heartache and pain this community is living each and every day. How many times has a Black child or their parent that I came into contact with experienced racism? How many times have they thought that I was showing those tendencies without me even realizing it? The Black educators at my school helped me understand certain things going on in the community, but I now realize it wasn't their job. It was my job to learn. I understand now that even though I thought I could relate to a lot of the hurt going on in the lives of my students, because I come from a family of trauma, in a way I could, but I also it wasn't the same. I used to tell my students that there are no excuses and to work hard despite their hardships, but I never got to the point of understanding what might happen once they did do that. I never realized that they could reach success yet still live in fear. I put myself through college. I had no help. I have worked hard to get where I'm at. I've worked my butt off. It's still not the same. Because here's the deal. I realize now that my students could work just as hard and make a great life for themselves, but still have to worry about being alone on a sidewalk and having someone call the cops on them just because of what they look like, and it sickens me to my core. I loved these kids and still do to this day. Although they're now in their late teens to 20s, they're still my kids. I've kept in contact with a lot of them and still encourage them in life as much as I can. I love getting a random direct message from one of them or a Facebook message or an email that just randomly comes to me. Weren't you my music teacher? It means so much to me. I've reached out to as many of them as I can, and I love seeing my students that have received college degrees and they're out there making a life for themselves. Some of them are college athletes, and we have gone back and forth with sports commentary with each other, and I love it because I think it doesn't just have to stop. Once they're in your classroom, you can continue being in these kids' lives as they get older. Still show up, still be relevant in their lives, and still show them that you care. Now, let me talk about me as a mom real quick. I'm honest and open with my own kids. I have 3 little boys. Yes, they're white. And so that already means that they're privileged and they're going to be able to just walk on a sidewalk one day without a second thought in the world. So it's important that I have conversations with them, but I'm also going to keep it at their age level. And here's a couple of examples of how that's already happened. My boy's cousin, she's half Black and she's beautiful. Recently, one of my boys stated Eden's skin is darker than mine. It just came out of the blue. He didn't mean anything by it. It was honestly just an observation. But instead of me just going, yeah, so, or, we had a conversation. We talked about how her skin is beautiful and how God creates everyone in his image. Although we can look different, he smiled and ran off to play, and he hasn't brought it back up. It was just a simple observation, and I know a lot of times those conversations can be uncomfortable if you let them be. But you have to realize with kids, they're honestly the most honest people I've ever known. You guys working with kids, you know that's true. They say what's ever on their mind. So simply looking at someone's skin and saying, their skin's darker than mine, they're just making an observation. What you do with that observation, that's up to you. But have the conversation and just state your thoughts about it. And then this is another conversation that's happened recently, is one of my son's friends is one of his very best friends. He's Black. They play basketball together. They go to school together. They're in the same class. And he came home one day and told me that Xavier looks just like him. And I said, oh, he does? Why? Why does he look like you? Because we both love basketball, and we both love basketball clothes, and we're the same height, Mom. I said, oh, really? And it made me teary-eyed. You know why? Because kids, they're like the most honest people, like I said earlier, and they just don't have like mean thoughts. Most of them. Okay, I can't speak for everyone. But kids just say what they're thinking. They have the best emotions. This is why it's important to teach kids these things while they're young, to encourage these conversations, because one day these same kids will grow into adults. So it is our part as adults to model and have the tough conversations and be there to listen, so we can show them with your actions and you as a role model. How are you living your life? That is the best example of how to live. So before we go, I want to just say I've made the pivot to working with teachers. You listening to this podcast, you may be new to my world. You may have been here a while. But while I work with teachers, my hope is to inspire you to be better teachers for your students, because I do truly think it's a ripple effect, and I do not take lightly that I'm in the position I'm in right now to help you and guide you as a music educator. And what I plan to do in my part is continuing to talk about racism, reading books to educate myself, attending PD myself, and volunteering in my community, teaching my boys, continuing to answer questions they might have, and not feel uncomfortable with the topic at hand. Everyone matters. We need to be accepting of all skin colors and backgrounds, but we also need to be willing to hear and understand those who don't look or act like we do as well. Your experiences, input, background, and life matter so much to me, and I want each and every one of you listening to this today to understand that and to know that you are important. And I am completely here to further this conversation. Send me a direct message on Instagram. Just find me at Jessica Peresta. Shoot me an email, jessica@thedomesticmusician.com. Let me know your thoughts, if you want to continue the conversation, or if you have any questions. And I would love to try to answer them the best I can. Like I said, I'm just a white teacher sharing my experience. And I hope that this has really helped somebody out with just me sharing my story. Have an amazing day, and I'll see y'all soon. Thank you so much for listening in to the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, I would love for you to review the show and leave a rating on iTunes. To find out more about how I can help you gain momentum in your elementary music teaching career, head to thedomesticmusician.com, where you'll find free downloads, courses, the blog, and so much more. Continue teaching music and never doubt the impact you're making each and every day in the lives of your students.